Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Watson Distinguished Speakers Series. A little bit of background on this. When I joined Watson in 2009, which is just shortly after our guest Marco joined or rather took over his branch of the Commission in December 2008, I thought it was an opportune time to have certain very high-profile speakers come in and tell us what's going on in their part of the world. So we've had Martin Wolf from the Financial Times and who else have we had in from that part? Lots of people. But anyway, we don't want to drop names. But nonetheless, we're now happy here to have Marco Butti with us. Reading from the bio, he's been Director General of Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission since December 2008, has studied at Florence and at Oxford, joined the Commission in '87, and basically now runs the shop. Now, for those of you who don't know a great deal about the EU, the Commission is the most important part of the EU because it's the bit that actually tries to get things done. Now, when things are going really well, the member states are very happy to let the Commission do things. When things are not going so well, the Commission becomes a bit of a political football, a bit of a scapegoat, and has a very hard task to do, as it has done ever since Marco took over the job. Europe has been in a crisis so long that the word crisis becomes boring in this context. But let's just say things haven't been going well. The Commission's job is to try and help Europe do better, despite its own best instincts on the domestic level. And with that, I will hand it over. Marco, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks to Brown and the Watson Institute for hosting this talk. I'm very grateful, and having very exciting days on all sides of the Atlantic. So I'm very glad to be here. Now, when I put together this presentation, and I will ask Mark to interrupt me if I go overboard with my time. And this has been the case for, let's say, for the past several months. I thought one has to overcome let's say, the economics instinct that the economists like me have and put the current European predicament in a broader setting. That's why I'm glad to have come here, where you have also more multidisciplinary approach. And you will see in this talk here that I will mix economic, institutional, and more political economy, or even political elements, and which I think is important to understand where Europe comes from and where it may be going. This is the outline of my presentation. I will present some Europe policy trilemmas. So trilemmas, basically, you'll see is a triangle. You can combine two of the corners, but the third one not. So one has to make a choice here, and you will see a bit what I mean later. Second, I'll go in more familiar grounds on more balanced policy mix, talking about fiscal policy, the role of structural reforms, and finally end with strengthening the governance of economic and monetary union in Europe. Now, overcoming Europe's policy trilemmas, the euro area, and I would argue also the EU as a whole, is built on Mandel trilemma, which is that you cannot have at the same time fixed exchange rate, free capital mobility, and independent monetary policies. So this comes directly from the Mandel-Fleming initial model of the early 1960s. So you have to choose two, and you cannot have the third one. So when we decided to move to the single currency in Europe, we decided to withhold the free capital mobility, and more broadly the single market in Europe, so the capacity to trade freely, so the so-called four freedom of circulation of people, services, goods, and capital. So the four freedom which make the single market in Europe. We decided to lock in fixed exchange rates by moving to a single currency. So by definition is permanently fixed exchange rate. The permanently then lately has been called into question, and we had to give up the independent monetary policies at the national level by giving the responsibility of monetary policy setting to an institution at the central level, which is the European Central Bank. So this has been how Europe has addressed the trilemma of Mandel. There is a European, let's say, twist on Mandel's trilemma, and it is that, as I mentioned before, the free movement of capital is embedded in the single market. And what we thought, and it was our experience at the end of the 1980s, it is very difficult to have a single market with full mobility and having floating exchange rates. I remember at the time the controversy when we had the so-called competitive devaluations between France and Italy or other countries. It was very difficult to have to convince policymakers to have to move to the single market, so with all full freedom, having still floating exchange rates. So it is true, and this is one of the points that I think is important to understand in the debate, because things have gone a little bit astray in a sense. It is true that the single currency in Europe was a political project. Yes, it was. It was a political project to anchor Germany and the reunited Germany within the continent, within the European Union. So there was an overriding political aim, but it was also an economic one. And the economic one was to combine, let's say, a single currency with the operation of the single market in a permanent way, avoid the recurrent controversies and tensions on competitive devaluation. So yes, there was this double element, which I think is important, anchoring Germany within Europe after the reunification in 1989, but also to address the deepening of European integration with a single market. So there was economic and I open and close the bracket immediately. I have described the single market as the quintessential for freedom. So free movement of people, capital, services, and goods. You can fast forward to today on the debate on Brexit, and those who try to keep things together after the Brexit and after the UK will have left the European Union following the referendum, in a sense they want to break the fourth freedom. So, and this I think is basically impossible to do. So it is going to be not going to be possible to have limits on migration and free movement of people within the EU, whilst at the same time participate in the other three freedoms. So I close the brackets here on the Brexit. Now, I've just described the original trilemma, which let's call it the Mandel Plus that I have indicated. But with the experience of economic and monetary union, the first 10 years or more, and actually 15 years, of having a single currency and deeper integration, other inconsistent trinities have come to the fore, of more economic nature or more political nature. This is a political integration inconsistent trinity, which is based on Roderick inconsistent trinity applied to globalization more generally. So what you can see here is that you cannot have at the same time deep political integration, nation-state institutions, so it means legitimacy of institutions only based on member states, so national legitimacy, and having traditional democratic processes. So you can combine here all these, two of these three, and you cannot get the third. Now, there is actually an historical sequence in this, because what we have here, if you can combine the two bottom corners here, you have, and it is indicated there in the little, I think you have the situation before the single market, basically going back to the early 1980s. So what we had there, we had vetoes at the European level. It was a lot based on unanimity in the decision making, and the legitimacy of decisions at the European level very much based on member states' governments. So if you take these two, this is the situation before the 1985 Single Act, which established the process moving towards the single market to be achieved at the time in 1992. So this was the... Now, with the Maastricht Treaty and the target to move to a single currency, we actually moved clockwise. So what we had here, we had deep political integration and democratic processes with the move towards more decision based on majority voting. The whole legislation of the single market was actually based on majority voting, not unanimity. Unanimity where every single member can stop the decision. So qualified majority and deeper political integration, because we moved to the not only towards the single market, but also with the introduction of the euro, sharing sovereignty much more in a much more advanced way than any time before. And we also built not only the rules, majority voting, but also the institutions in order to support this with the creation of the European Central Bank, which is, let's say, quintessential federal institution. So this was the move from down, the two, before mid-80s, to the left-hand side, left top corners, with the Maastricht Treaty till the beginning of till the crisis, or till, let's say, mid 2007 or so. And then with the crisis, we have continued clockwise. And we have actually ended up with a combination of deep political integration and nation states institutions, because there has been the return of what we call the intergovernmental model of decision making, where the decision making is not based on common institutions, so proposals by the Commission, discussion in the Council, so the member states together with the Parliament, but it has been essentially the European Council, which is the forum where the leaders of the EU meet and decide, which has taken, let's say, the lead in this. And in the European Council, what you have is that basically everybody has to agree. Everybody has to agree with a twist, because it is clear that when, during the crisis, we had some countries getting deeply into troubles, the voice of these countries actually having with the shoulders against the wall, even if formally they had unanimity, they could block. When the market opened the next day and they could bring down the country during the sovereign debt crisis, actually their voice was much more diminished. So here, we moved to a situation in which we still have deep political integration. We created new institutions during the crisis, the European Stability Mechanism, and the banking union institutions, but based very much on this intergovernmental. Now, this is, in my view, not tenable if one looks forward. So, in a sense, we would have to go back to a situation in which you have this deep political integration being anchored into more democratic processes, going back to majority voting, non-unanimity. So it would mean creating institutions which are based not only in national legitimacy, like the single government, but also more broadly to EU and Euro area legitimacy. So this is the, let's say, the first inconsistent trinity that we have faced. Now, the second one is of more policy and economic nature. And it is that one can, and this I think applies to advanced economies more broadly, not only to European ones. I think you cannot have, let's say, low potential growth, so without the necessary structural reforms which help to boost growth, and at the same time maintain, sound public finances, so sustainable level of debt, and also sustainable, say, in European terms, generous welfare models. So here again, I mean, you cannot have all this. So the way to, I think, address this is to solve the triangle for the, let's say, with the choice of the right corner. One would have to have, I think, more structural reforms which boost potential growth, make the markets function better, equip the workforce with the right skills, and so on and so forth, which would help then to generate the necessary resources to continue to have sustainable welfare models and having debt and deficit sufficiently, under control. So this is the second one, and then a third one, which is the third and final inconsistent trinity, pertains precisely to the Eurozone current conundrum. We know, and you all follow this, we are stuck in, not only in Europe, but I think worldwide, with a very, very low inflation, so the lowflation trap. Within Europe, you have, within the Euro area in particular, you have different countries, and these, let's say, some of the more vulnerable countries will have to address the two problems that I have indicated in the bottom two corners here. One is that they will have to become more competitive than the rest, gain competitiveness in order to, let's say, drive down and repay the external debt that they have accumulated in the past. At the same time, there are also those countries which have high public debt, not only public but also private debt, high public debt. So these countries, what they would want, they would want to have, in order to gain competitiveness, to have an inflation rate properly measured below the average inflation of the zone in order to gain competitiveness. But they need to have sufficiently high inflation in order, let's say, via the denominator, to bring down debt, both private and public. And here is the problem, because if you are stuck with very, very low inflation, and now we have currently almost zero inflation, the two objectives of sustainable debt and gaining competitiveness, they come into conflict, clearly. Because in order to gain competitiveness, you need to go into deflation, into, let's say, more than deflation, negative inflation, but this, via the denominator, increases the debt level. So here, what you would want to have is inflation which is sufficiently high in order to meet the two objectives at the same time. And we know, and here has been one of the prescriptions actually by the G20 in Hangzhou a month ago, you cannot leave the boosting of inflation, getting out of this low inflation trap, only to the central banks. And here the G20 talked to the Fed, it talked to the Bank of Japan, it talked to the ECB. So you need to have other policies also, and not only the monetary policy. So if you solve these three trilemmas via what I consider to be the right corner, then you get to the consistent trinity, which is what I call here a new political synthesis. You need structural reforms to boost potential growth, so to generate sufficient resources to have the cake increasing. You have a more balanced policy mix, so not only monetary policy but also fiscal policy to boost growth and to increase inflation, and also strengthening the EU dimension of policy making. This is the, let's say, the first inconsistent trinity. So this is, let's say, what one would want to have, having looked at the, let's say, at the European conundrum through this political, institutional, and economic perspectives. Now, I said we need a more balanced policy mix. Use of fiscal policy. Mark has published a bestseller on austerity, so he's here I come into dangerous ground with him, so he's watching me very closely.
It's okay, you've come a long way.
I have come a long way, yes. Then, okay, fine. Let me not add anything else. Okay, okay. Also, how to get on more contribution of fiscal policy on this? It means, let's say, more Keynesian policy. And we have a number of rules in Europe. We have the Stability and Growth Pact, which restrict the excessive deficit procedure anchored in the treaty. So it's primary legislation. It's not just code of conduct. So we need to see how we use fiscal policy in a more active way. Okay, the first thing is that, okay, well, where do we come from? Here is the public debt before and after the crisis, and you see a number of countries. Here you see that debt has gone up a lot from before the crisis. To be fair and to be correct, this debt here has gone up essentially not because of profligacy, not because of easy spending. It has gone up in several of these countries essentially because of recapitalizing the banks and fixing the banking system. So, in a sense, a private debt in the banking system has been translated into public debt. One can discuss the wisdom of this, but that is what happened, and I think it was done. I think for, in a sense, all naturally in order to sustain financial stability and keep going. And you can see also, and this I think Mark would agree, you see also that public and private debt have gone up from before the crisis. Private debt has gone up even more than before the crisis. And I think in interpreting the troubles of Europe, those who think that it is because of fiscal misbehavior, they get it wrong. I think it is essentially not that. I think the roots of the crisis in several of these countries, they actually pertain to misbehavior in the financial and the private sector, misallocation of resources there. But I say, but we were somewhat unlucky also because the most prominent case, and it is not here because it doesn't, I mean, the y-axis will have to be too big to encompass it. We had Greece. And Greece indeed was a fiscal crisis. It was more than a fiscal crisis, but was certainly fiscal was when discovering that all of a sudden from a target of below 3% of GDP, you move to realization that you get to 13%. There is something that is clearly wrong. So this to say that we have the legacy of the debt which is with us, which somehow constrains the use of fiscal policy in a very active manner. It is interesting to see, and I put it in this graph here. The slides can be distributed later, so you can look at the specific numbers here. But I have put here fiscal policy behavior in the euro area versus the US to see. And what you can see here is that in 2008 and 2009, when you are below zero here, this is an expansionary fiscal policy. expansionary discretionary fiscal policy. So this is the fiscal stance, is the change in the cyclically adjusted budget balance and netting one-off effects. So what you can see is that 2008, 2009, there was a strong impulse, fiscal impulse, and then after that, after the Toronto, they went, the two countries, the two areas, so US and the Euro area, they moved into a consolidation phase. If you take the integral of all this since 2008, you see, since the beginning of the crisis, US and Euro area, the integral meaning what the change in the period, it's basically the same. If you add the histograms here, the bars, you get to more or less the same number. What you have had, however, in Europe, the reaction has been less strong than in the US, which has been a strong fiscal impulse in the initial years of the crisis before going into a consolidation path. So we have not had at the beginning such a different behavior, but the intensity clearly has been more in the US and Europe. But then we went into a consolidation path. That's when actually we faced the sovereign debt crisis, which put us very much shoulder against the wall. Now, the issue is then, okay, if you have to use fiscal policy in a more, let's say, supportive, in more active manner, how do you measure, fiscal space? So how much fiscal space do you have? In the debate, you look at what Paul Krugman, Larry Summers write. They say, look, we have so low interest rates that it would be, it would be very logical now to use the opportunity and do a lot of public investment, infrastructure investment, borrowing at very low rates, as is the case now. But focusing only on the low interest rates, I think, does not capture the whole picture. And here, what I have done is I have taken a paper by Blanchard, which goes back to 1984, and where he introduces the concept of maximum politically sustainable debt. The maximum politically sustainable debt is given by the expression here on the right, where you have on the denominator the maximum politically achievable primary surplus. So this is primary surplus in the P hat. This is what is given. It is given by the let's say the minimum level of spending that you can sustain socially by reducing all the rest, and the maximum level of taxes you can levy without going into an impossible situation. So, and then on the denominator you have the let's say the normal interest rate, which has gone down quite a lot, and there is a lot of discussion on the fact that the normal interest rates actually has decreased substantially. This is behind the view of secular stagnation of Larry Summers. And you have also the potential growth rate. Now, if you take this as capturing the fiscal space, how the measurement of the fiscal space, what this expression tells you is that once you have exceeded the B hat, which is the maximum politically sustainable public debt, then you cannot come down anymore, because you cannot raise the primary surplus anymore. So you are stuck. The only way is default. So that is so if you take all this, my contention is that the fiscal space, there is more fiscal space, especially in a number of countries like Germany or the Netherlands in Europe, but there is not all that huge fiscal space. Because if you take here, it is true that R star has come down, but Y star has come down as well. And with the demography, actually, potential growth is going to go down more, and the maximum politically sustainable, politically achievable primary surplus, P hat, I think is going to go down in the future because we have to spend more on education, we have to spend more on welfare benefits and so on and so forth. So I think the fiscal space is not as large as one would conclude by simply focusing on the interest rate. So we can use certainly more fiscal space, but not all that much more. Now, moving to the second element, which is the role of structural reforms. This is something that we can also discuss later about. Now, what are structural reforms? Because we talk about a lot about structural reforms are supply-side reforms. So what we discuss in Keynesian terms is the demand-side policies, what I have discussed right now. So using fiscal space, more active fiscal policy belongs to the demand side of the equation. These are the policies that boost the supply side. And you can think about boosting the supply side in terms of a production function. A production function is given by the input of labor, the input of capital, and the input of, let's say, total factor productivity. That's what, if you write a production function, the components of this. So structural reforms are those who boost the labor participation, who increase capital, help increase capital, the K in the production function, and the total factor productivity. Reforms that make markets more flexible, more reactive, I think they're all reforms which are, help to boost growth in the longer term. In the first year of the crisis, we focused essentially on competition enhancing aspects or adjustment like labor market flexibility. I think countries here had to recover competitiveness. They had to make reforms that slash costs and make the labor market more flexible. What we are going to do now, and what we are doing now is what I put here as structural reforms 2.0. I think is put more emphasis on enhancing human capital, so education, investing in R&D and things that are, let's say, more positive for the economy, tackling rent seeking, which is, I think, is very important. And also, I think what we need to do more and more, we'll have to factor in the issue of inclusiveness and income distribution in the equation, because I mean we have if there is no acceptance that reforms are necessary and in a sense everybody participates in this, so taking care of income distribution is going to be very, very difficult to push them through. Now, okay, here I have a slide on the estimated impacts with our macroeconometric model of the structural reforms, but you can see it yourself. I passed all over this. Now, there are two views on the structural reforms, of boosting structural reform. The first view is the typical Keynesian view. The Keynesian view says, okay, structural reforms may actually hurt in the short term, because what you do labor market reforms, you reduce the wage share, you reduce demand, and you have let's say negative impact in the very short term. So Keynesian views is that do reforms when in periods of high growth, when the cake is expanding, so in a sense you can absorb them more easily, and you can also compensate the losers, because structural reforms is not good for everybody. When you get Uber comes in and the taxi licenses, value collapsed to zero, the taxi drivers are on the losers side. And you have many other examples of this sort. So use the expanding cake to compensate the losers. So this is the first view. Do structural reforms in good times. Second view is the TINA view. What is the TINA view? The TINA view is there is no alternative. So this is the view that actually, because structural reforms are difficult to do, member states, when things go well, don't do them. So this is the typical, let's call it, this is the German view. Is the view which emphasizes the moral hazard element. Difficult choices only when you are shoulders against the wall. So this is the two views. Now, who is right? I give you an answer in theory, and I give you an answer in practice. Now, the answer in theory is, makes reference to a paper actually I worked on with the data. It was just before, let's say, before the crisis. And there, the answer, we had a model with two periods in which the structural reforms, let's say, operate only, help only in the second period, and you have a cost in structural reforms in the first period. Now, the short answer of working through the model is that of the two views, which one, the one that prevails depends on the discount rate of governments. So basically, a government which has a long time horizon, so far away from elections, so it means a low discount rate. For this type of government, then there is, let's say, the Keynesian view prevails. So it means that for this kind of government, which has a longer time horizon, allow some more room for maneuver in the short term, and you would get actually the government using it properly and doing the structural reforms. Instead, if the time horizon of the government is very short, and we measure that in the empirical analysis by the distance to the next election, then the opposite is true. It is there by having more constraints and having, being in let's say in bad times triggers more the structural reform. So there is not let's say an unequivocal view on this. This is the theory, plus the empirical evidence from before the crisis. During the crisis, and here I have some evidence, but I'm not presenting it to you, but you have a lot of work that we did, the European Commission, we did at the OECD. Actually, the governments which were more active in structural reforms were those more in trouble. So it was, in a sense, from the behavior during the crisis, the TINA view seemed to have the upper hand. So in a sense, this comforted a bit Germany, a German politician saying that you see, if you have more fiscal leeway, making things better, or if you have the European Central Bank keeping the interest rates very low with very expansionary monetary policy, this is bad for reforms. Because member states, instead of seizing the opportunity of this macroeconomic help, they do the opposite. They relax, they don't do the structural reforms. It's only when you push them shoulder against the wall that they find the courage to do the structural reforms. This is the thing. Let me go quickly here and finishing on the strengthening EMU governance, and we can go back to other things if you so wish. Okay, we have done quite a lot during the crisis to equip ourselves to complete economic and monetary union. It was very difficult. I mean, Mark mentioned at the beginning, I mean, I came in, it was basically almost this, I think it was the weeks of Lehman Brothers. So if you think I bring good luck, touch wood, you have the opportunity now. It was very difficult very difficult work because basically the economic architecture was not ready for such a huge shock. Not only, but the deep down, the views between, let's say, Germany and Nordic countries on the one hand, and the others, France, but also Italy and the Mediterranean countries were very divergent. So, in a sense, we had to fix the engine while flying, and it's not very comfortable thing to do. So what did we do? I mean, we started to establish banking union. We are still halfway through, but we are working on that. I think we have also set up the ESM. By the way, if you look at our documents, plenty of acronyms, all invented during the crisis. Actually, I gave a lecture once to an audience a bit like this. I think probably even more diversified by nationality. And I started to ask, I did a little test on our acronyms. Those who answered rightly were mostly the Chinese students. So they had, and I have to say, no, I have to say that when I deal in my G20 responsibilities with the others, the Chinese also at the policy making level, they are those who know all our acronyms very, very well. It tells you a lot. Okay, but I close this funny bracket a bit like now. So, I mean, we have to go to, I think, continue to complete banking union. I think we will have to banking union and economic and monetary union. I think we have to establish a euro area safe asset, which is important. Doesn't have to be a euro bond with full mutualization, but I think we need to have a safe asset for the system, financial system to work well. I think we need to have a euro area fiscal capacity. There are different models in that. So that is, I think, something that needs to be done. Final slide is that I think it would be important to have, I mean, to understand the political economy of all this. I mean, we are criticized in Europe, especially by Germany and the Netherlands, other Finland, other Nordic countries, for enforcing the Stability and Growth Pact, the fiscal rules, in a not very rigorous manner. I think that it would be I think it would be important that these countries understand that we would have a better, I think we would have better chance and more legitimacy to enforce the fiscal rules that we have in a proper way had we had a central risk sharing tool, so a fiscal capacity. So this, I think, is. The second point is that the example of the US tells you very well, and I had also some slides that can be then distributed to you. If you look at this risk sharing in the US versus the euro area, you have a lot of risk sharing via the capital markets and by financial markets. Why? Because you have diversified portfolios. So if you have a problem in one state, in a sense, you have other. I mean, the impact that you get is much less than if you have all your portfolio invested in assets of that state, and you have capital also labor actually moving from one state to another. In Europe, it is the opposite. I mean, we have very little risk sharing via financial markets. So if we would finalize banking union and the new projects with capital markets union, much deeper capital markets, then in a sense we would have less pressure to do risk sharing via the public budget. So Germany does not like to have public risk sharing by the fear of a transfer union that would transfer money from Germany to the other countries. If they would allow the completion of financial integration by banking union and capital market union, I think we could do less risk sharing via the budget. And finally, I mentioned it before, I mean, if we have more risk sharing, more active fiscal policy, a fiscal capacity, I think we would help prevent overburdening the monetary policy and have a more balanced policy mix, which I think is something which would help a lot right now. Okay, I think I can stop here. Thank you.
Very much. Now, the Distinguished Speakers series is slightly different from your standard talk because I'm not going to just invite you all to have a talk right now because I've got some questions. This is called Chair's Prerogative Gets Abused. We do this little part as a conversation. I'm not going to take too long, but I want to set out certain issues so that we're kind of narrowing the agenda a little bit and trying to get into what at least I think are the most important issues. So let's start off with structural reform because that's the one that seems to be the key to growth. And I was particularly interested in this notion of structural reforms 2.0, enhancing skills and getting rid of rent seeking, which is obviously very important. Now, in the abstract sense, we can define a production function, we can estimate TFP catch-up, we can figure out the impulse ratios and do all the stuff to figure out what works in the abstract. But you're an Italian, so let me give you ultimate power. You're now the Monti government with no constraints. Give me the top 5 things that you would do to Italy in terms of structural reform, and then tell me how confident you would be that they would really produce growth. Or even the top 3.
Okay. I mean, this is okay. This is a sharp question. Now, okay. First of all, let me say that Monti, I think, he saved the country in that very moment. Then I think his popularity has decreased very dramatically afterwards. So I would not. I'm not sure that I would put myself in his shoes right now. But okay, let me try anyway. Yeah. No, I think what you have, and it is, I think, typical not only of Italy but more broadly, I think, on peripheral countries. I think there is an issue of efficiency and effectiveness of public administration. I think this is absolutely key, because if we do not improve public administration, the functioning, the right incentives is going to be. Are there some Italians here? Just to.
Not yet. Yes.
Ah, yes. Okay, fine. I mean, maybe you can say whether you agree or not with my list. Okay, so public administration, I think, is very important, and it is very important for Mediterranean countries throughout. I mean, I know that there has been many criticisms of what we did in Greece. I think the excessive austerity at the time, I think one can acknowledge that if we would have to rerun history, we would have probably a more, let's say, a more gradual path. Even though when all of a sudden you discover that you have 10 percentage points of GDP out of conceiving the facts being revealed, I mean the patience and the degree of solidarity from the others, from the other member states toward the country, not necessarily very natural. But I'm mentioning Greece because if one looks at our memorandum of understanding, reads it, the part on, let's say, fiscal discipline, fiscal prudence is actually the minor one, a minor one. What we had to do in Greece is to rebuild the country from scratch. I mean, and there, public administration was absolutely key. I mean, we went to the ministries and asked with the so-called Troika, so it was us, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, and say, okay, let's look at the books. How many employees do you have, Minister of Education? They stared us in the face. We don't know. What do you mean you don't know? And so this is just one example of the many things. So I think public administration is definitely a key issue. Second point, and this is more in the present juncture, what I would do is I would overhaul the financial system and the banks. I mean, we are in Europe in general, in Italy in particular, vastly overbanked. We have too many banks and too many, the pervasiveness that is, and they are all, or most of them, pretty inefficient. And I mean, the issue of low entrenched profitability of banks, I think, is a key structural issue. So we will need to revamp that very substantially. I hesitate on the third one. To be politically correct, I would put in, let's say, institutional reforms, which will be the subject of the referendum on the 4th of December. I think somewhat reducing the cost of politics as is done, and reducing, let's say, the pervasiveness and the intrusiveness of the political system, I think, is important. So, but not being very politically correct, I'll leave it. I think I'll leave that out, and maybe I put in I think the rent-seeking issue and the functioning of product and services markets, which I think is very very inefficient.
No, it's very interesting you should say that, because that's very different from what we had as the original notion of structural reform, which was based upon primarily cost competitiveness and wages, etc. And it takes us to a very different place. This seems to be an eminently reasonable agenda. Yet it seems to be very hard for politicians, both at the level of the EU, policymakers at the level of the EU, and politicians at the domestic level, to make such a clear case. Why do you think that is?
Okay, I think there is, first of all, what has determined the political behavior during the crisis is the so-called ultima ratio. What does it mean, ultima ratio? Is, in a sense, encompasses what I was describing before, which is moving only when you are short against the wall. So that is, what is the sequence of ultima ratio? Is that apply this to the crisis in Europe. The first one is denial. You are actually, in coming down, you were mentioning the Per Steinbrück, who was the finance minister of Germany at the beginning of the crisis, said, this is not our crisis, this is subprime, this is the Anglo-Saxon, is the US thing, nothing to do with
These
us.
are not the droids you're looking for.
So that is this was the ultima ratio runs like this. This is the first stage, denial. The second stage is, we indeed have a problem, but you have to solve it each one at home. So you put your house in order. This is the second stage. The third stage is that indeed we may have a more systemic issue, but the answer is too little, too late. Fourth stage is that indeed you have your shoulder against the wall, you're staring to the abyss, you have you are a near-death situation, as we were in 2011, and then you find all of a sudden the courage to act. And that was in 2012. 2012 was the decision on banking union in June 2012, which is a very important sharing of sovereignty. And it was the speech of Mario Draghi at the London School of Economics. It was a pity he was not here, because it was an historical speech, which was in July 2012, which was the whatever it takes. We will do whatever it takes, and that immediately changed the pattern of the crisis. So this is the I think it's the fourth stage, but there is a fifth one, and the fifth one is that as soon as the situation improves, there is backtracking. Keep in mind these various stages and apply it now to the migration crisis that we have. You can trace it.
Same thing.
Exactly the same. The only thing is, unlike the euro area crisis, we have not come to the end.
Yeah, and there's no Draghi to save you on this.
And there is no Draghi to save you, and that is actually a very, very important point. So you do not have a Deus ex machina to do that. Why do I say all this? Because if this is the pattern of actually decision making, then the structural reforms and growth, do not fall into that pattern of behavior. The situation will actually have to get much worse before one finds the courage to get better. Now, for our job as European institutions, as the European Commission, is to make relentlessly the case for that type, let's say I put it structural reforms 2.0. I think they make sense. It will also, by encompassing the income distribution element, I think hopefully will also take into account let's say what is going on now with the populist rise in Europe and elsewhere, and they say convince politicians that by moving in that direction you can actually also fend off these populist threats that you have widespread in advanced economies.
Correct. So we can bring everyone else, and I only have one more question, and let's put this in a global perspective. Go back to the Blanchard model there. We have a world, not just the EU. Now, the EU is a large part of the world. It's 40% of global consumption. It's a big place. What happens there matters for everyone else. But we have unbelievably low inflation, despite the fact that central banks around the world have chucked 13 trillion euros, yen, and everything else into the money supply. And we have very, very low interest rates. And we have, particularly in Europe, a central bank that, in a sense, has become a prisoner of its own policies, buying assets to keep yields down. So R star is way below where we think it is. Y star, as a consequence, is probably down below where we think it is, demographic and other factors, right? So this isn't just Europe's problem. So let's go back to where we started. When this crisis broke up, one of the big discussion points between me, you, and others was the debt. Where did it come from, etc. Well, now we have it. Now we know where it came from. We know that most of it's actually private. Let's deal with it. What are we going to do with all of this if Y star, the growth rate, is very low? Because the temptation is to assume that R star is going to, the interest rate is going to stay very, very low as far as you go. It might not. Could be dangerous if it goes up. But even if it does, do we just do what Austria suggested at the IMF about a year ago? We just kind of live with it. We just roll it, extend the maturities, drop the coupon, roll it out, and kind of live with a very high level of debt. Is that the best global option, or does the Commission think there's another way?
Okay.
Nice small question for you.
No, you have all tough questions. Then actually, I will.
You got one back?
You put question, and then I put one to you.
Okay.
Now on this, I think there is I think you can clearly also theoretically make the link between the I and the Y. This is, I think, the link is persuasive at the global level. Mm-hmm. You can have differentiations at the national level because you can have, especially on the on the Y, so on potential growth. It depends very much on the reforms that you make. Here, the spectrum of this behind what you were describing is Japan, huh? Mm-hmm. Because basically what you have there is that is very low growth, even though at the per capita level they have not done all that badly. That's why. Fine, yeah. That's why I mean it seemed to be a rather unsatisfactory but reasonably stable equilibrium. Even though they had to add in order to avoid the deflationary spiral, they had to add QQE plus the whole thing, plus the fiscal stimulus. No. My feeling is that there is a debate out there, Bob Gordon versus the technology optimists. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think we can grow more than what we have so far. I think we have in front of us technological innovations which are going to reshape the way we work. And the way we create wealth, so I think we can grow more if we do the right type of structural reforms and we get it right in the short term on the macroeconomic policies. I think we have prospects to grow more. I do not believe that secular stagnation is ineluctable and inevitable. So I think we can do more of what and better what we have done, and with the structural reforms, I think we can go on a higher growth path. What is somewhat comforting from the point of view of the sustainability of that there is a lot of demand for safe assets. Yeah. And moving into up in the demographic ladder, you have more and more demand for safe assets. That's why. It is not going. I mean, we can get to a equilibrium level of sustainable debt, which is somewhat higher than what we had expected or projected before.
Because the R star has dropped.
Yeah. So that is the. No, the question for you was that you asked me about what one would do in Italy and let's say the peripheral countries.
Yeah.
What would you do?
What would I do?
In the case of Germany?
If I were Germany, I'd leave the euro. It would save everybody so much grief, but that will never happen. So, what would I do in the periphery countries themselves? So much of it comes, I mean, this is where I'm very much in agreement with 2.0. So here's my issue. If we mean competitiveness, competitiveness is always relative. And within a trading bloc that primarily trades with itself, wage reductions against one is pretty much zero sum against the other. There's only so much you can do with this. Now, certain sectors, of course, prior to the crisis, living off imported capital, got completely out of whack. If you think about the Spanish real estate sector's 8% of GDP, there had to be an adjustment. I mean, this much is obvious. But we need to go something more than that, and we need something that publics can believe in. At the end of the day, for me, Europe has been a powerful thing because it's been something better and greater than the nation state to believe in. And that needs to be articulated and constantly reaffirmed. And it seems to be the failure to do that has caused a lot of the damage as much as anything else. We spoke earlier and privately about trust. Moral hazard is what economists call trust. It's very hard to run things if people don't trust each other. And if we build a concern with trust into our institutions such that we cannot trust each other, we write into the script that there is no trust, it's very hard to move forward. So my answer to this is to take exactly those 2.0 structural reforms and try and get the domestic political elites to buy into that and push it forward, because I think it would be incredibly popular. I mean, to take Italy, I'll give you my favourite little anecdote on this. When I was at the EUI once, you walk outside of this wonderful converted villa come monastery that the EUI is in, and I was with Wolfgang Streeck, the political economist, and he came outside and he said, "Here, do you want to understand the European political economy?" I said, "Yeah." "Okay, come outside." So I stood outside. It's a tiny little narrow road. He says, "First of all, this is a major road. It has no sidewalks." That tells you a lot about Italian public spending. But more importantly, look up on the hills. And have you looked up on the hill, there were gorgeous villas, huge, absolutely enormous villas. He says, "Who's up there?" I said, "I have no idea." He says, "The same people that have been running the country for the past 500 years. And this isn't just true of Italy, this is true of large chunks of Europe. So until the sort of the lock-in that the long-term political establishment is broken, it's very, very hard for people to believe that Europe is worth the candle. So I am fully committed to Agenda 2.0. I think it's exactly the way to go. All you need to do is get the domestic elites to buy into it. That's the hard part. And with that, first of all, Tony.
Yeah,
And here, yeah.
actually, what was curious to me is in 2.0, and in fact in the entire discussion, there's no talk about tax policy. The BHAT, the limit on the politically acceptable, is almost as if taxes couldn't be raised to lower part of the deficit problem. In the restructuring problem, the question of tax policy isn't there. In the old version, we know what it was, is to keep them as low as possible. In the new version, maybe that's not so true. And I'm wondering where you think there might be fiscal space in the Union for the harmonization of tax policies and for their increase. And I go back to the Uber example. I mean, Uber is not only revolutionizing the labor markets and the product markets, but it's also causing fantastic problems for taxation. And where is the union on that dimension?
Okay. No, very good point. Okay, in my P-hat, that is the difference between the minimum politically acceptable level of spending and the maximum politically affordable level of taxes. So this is the definition of the conceptual definition of that. I think you put the right point, and I did not mention it in my talk. I mean, so far what we have, the message has been in Europe. Okay, we have a high level taxation countries in general, but the message has been, okay, broaden the tax base, avoid exceptions, making them as as broad as possible, and through that allows a reduction in the tax rates. So this has been, and implicit also, there has been some, let's say, acquiescence to the movement towards lower progressivity, which has taken place in the past 20 years. Mirroring a bit what happened in these countries at a different scale, but this also have been the trend. Now, I think we have to rethink taxation in a more fundamental way, and has to be part of the 2.0 also. I think here the issue of tax progressivity has to come into the picture again, and the issue of taxation of assets also. It is not an easy way, and clearly here at least the European dimension is the right one, because if you try to do this at each member state level, is not going to work. And we were discussing with Mark before about how to communicate added value of Europe. I was mentioning the, let's say, new European public goods has to deal with migration, with defense, with security. I think on the taxation side also one would have to come into the picture. And I think the issue of progressivity to also ensure a better allocation of resources, a more fair allocation of resources, I think has to come into the picture. There is a macroeconomic relevance also in this, because, and we have done some studies on that, the effect is not large, but is not negligible either. With the skewed distribution of resources, given the propensity to save and the propensity to consume is different according to different income and wealth, if one has somewhat more progressivity, then you will also increase and reduce the tax rate for the middle class. Then you also move into higher consumption patterns. So it would help the recovery in the shorter term.
Can I push one? It would seem to me that the progressivity, and particularly inheritance, and I mean going back to these elites in Europe, is particularly strong because if I'm not wrong, the tax rates, income and corporate tax rates are lower in Europe, or were until very recently, than in the States. And part of that is because the European welfare state was funded on the back of consumption. And I'm not sure what's happened in the last few years, but what the share of total income is coming from consumption taxes versus wealth taxes and income taxes. But it seems like paradoxically Europe moved away from progressivity quite strongly at the moment over the last 20 years, right? Is that fair?
No, I think that is a fair assessment. I think you are right. You are right on this, and I think a deeper thinking has to come.
The good news is it means that there's more you can do on that angle. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, practically the whole world needs decent tax reform, but it means that, if Europe recognises this, they've actually got perhaps more room on taxes than they do on formal fiscal space, for example.
I mean, if I mentioned before the G20, I think one of the success stories, I think, in the G20 is the more coordination that has been is being established at the international level on preventing tax havens,
Common base erosion, etc.
Exactly. So what it's called the BEPS, base erosion, probably shifting policy. I think, and Europe here has been at the forefront in pushing that. So I think building on that, I think one can certainly do more.
First Apple, tomorrow Switzerland. Moving on. So.
Yeah, hi, I'm Patrick, PhD student here. My question goes also in your direction a little bit. It's about trust and the popularity in Europe. And I have a feeling like, I mean, if you want to answer or if you want to deal with some of the problems you described today, you need to go towards a little bit something like the fiscal union. But at the same time, there's like this vicious downwards spiral where, like, if you need to do, whenever you need to do a structural reform, you're right, there are like problems in the short term, you will not make everybody happy, and as a politician, you kind of have like, you have two options here. You can either say, look, it's good for our country in the long term, and I really stand behind that, but that's very unpopular. So your second option is to say, hey, gee, like, I really don't want to do that, but the EU says we need to do that, and it's kind of important that we do that. I don't like that, but the EU like makes me do this, and so this makes the EU like more unpopular over time, and so you have less people who vote for the EU or vote for EU positive parties in the end, and this makes more integration less likely. And my question is like, how do you step at the European Commission level, up to that?
I think you hit the nail on the top.
On the head.
Because I recognize exactly through looking back. I was having a flash of my career going back while you were talking. We have traditionally been accepted to be the scapegoats. So in a sense, what you had is that, okay, we recommended a number of things to do. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you got it wrong. But on the social reform side, okay, things that politicians have troubles in accepting to do that themselves, but by having a collective decision, Europe recommending it, doing it all together, the thought was that it would be easier, let's say, to then make the difficult political choices at the national, less difficult to do at the national level. Now, this was before the crisis, and I think we accepted to play that nasty role as part of our job, job description. And at the end of the day, you acquire this, and you accept this, and if that helps to push the right policies at the national level, be it. An assumption behind that model, which I think in your questions is called into question rightly, is that the assumption is that you need to have, and we were discussing upstairs, that main political parties, they are in a sense sufficiently pro-European, and the population at large is sufficiently pro-European that the stock, let's say, of trust in Europe is so high that even if you chip away a bit of delta by being unpopular on that front, it still remains, very acceptable.
Robust,
and the median voter, in any case, is with you. So this was now the problem with the crisis has been that we have shifted into a situation in which the trust has decreased, and now the blaming of Europe for doing unpopular choices, because in a sense politicians, instead of take responsibilities, they finger point Brussels. This is not something that one can afford any longer. So I think this is, and actually I would advise you, if you have time and will, to look at my one of my little papers, which from which I took the political dilemmas, the very first trilemma, and you have another one there, but which I have not presented, which is precisely on blaming Brussels. One cannot afford anymore to have finger pointing Brussels for having taking decisions which are necessary, and hope that this would maintain trust in Europe and even political stability at home. So this is the key issue. So this describes well, I think, the problem. And now on how to get out of that corner, then that is very, very difficult. But you need to have, let's say, let's say collective acknowledgement of collective responsibility, so that the choices has to be made in a collective way. If one look, I was looking before coming to the Eurobarometer, which is the survey that we do regularly, taking the temperature on various issues. And there is one question which addresses precisely one that you raise, which is to what extent the fact that we make certain choices collectively, so certain rather painful choice collectively, help to accept it at home, domestically. And the answer is pretty striking. In most of the countries, it does not help anymore. So this is an evolution, because in the past, let's say before the crisis, to the same question, the answer would have been overwhelmingly yes. Okay, we do it together. It is easier for me to accept also to shoulder some of the costs. Now it is not true anymore. So I think this, in a sense, put squarely on the table the issue of political integration and what we want to do it together. It is not possible to do it by stealth, by simply attributing to the Commission, listening to the Commission what it says. Okay, it's Europe asking, so we have to do it. It does not work anymore.
They need to recommit and take responsibility.
Yeah, in a very
public way.
public and
No,
in
it's
conscientious way.
Yes. Hold on, and then we're gonna pass.
Yeah, grazie for a very balanced talk. You mentioned Germany as a major case of a country that has lots of fiscal space, right? So it could, pump its fiscal policy to complement, very loose monetary policy. And as you know, the IMF has been constantly urging Germany to do exactly that. This is why right now relations between Germany and the IMF are at an all-time low, because for the German policy-making elite, the whole notion of fiscal space is basically an Anglo-Saxon ploy, conspiracy, and myth that doesn't really exist, right? So they say our number one priority is debt. Fiscal space doesn't exist, and even if we would pump fiscal policy, it wouldn't really work because we're already at full employment. So in an economy running at full speed, you would risk overburdening it with pumping ever more money into it. Second, they say you couldn't really do anything with the money because there's all the whole counter argument to fiscal policy in terms of financial crisis that you have the whole lag, right? So you don't have so many projects ready right now that you could just finance through fiscal policy, right? And then the third point is that even if Germany would do that, it wouldn't really benefit the South and ailing countries because the stuff that you would need to build new bridges and whatever in Germany wouldn't be imported from Italy and Spain and Greece and whatnot, right? So it wouldn't even help other European countries at all. How would you respond to this? And what would be the general stance of the European Commission on this? Because it has been more reticent than the IMF, obviously for political reasons. But would the Commission on the whole favor more fiscal policy in Germany and maybe also the Netherlands, for instance?
Okay, good question, well articulated. Now on the fiscal space in Germany, first of all, the quantification of the fiscal space in Germany. Germany has a surplus now, both in headline and in structural terms. Then there are, let's say, objectives set collectively at the European level, so which is the so-called definition medium-term objective. MTO is one of the many acronyms. For Germany, it is 0.5% deficit in structural terms. They have also a debt brake enshrined in the constitution, which is more restrictive than that. Give and take, they have today about 1% of GDP fiscal space without breaking any rules, neither domestic nor European. So this is the amount that fiscal space potentially available to be exploited. Now, in Europe right now, we face a paradox. And the paradox is that those who do not have a fiscal space, they want to spend, and those who have fiscal space, they don't want to use it. So there is an issue here of distribution problem. Now, I think some of the question of the points that Germany makes are real. It is true that they say you look at the labor market pretty much full capacity. It is also true that in terms of public investment directly, not easy to do it in the very short term. It's going to take time. It's going to take time because of the very complex federal architecture of Germany, where the lenders have a lot of. Now, are there needs of public investment in Germany? The answer is yes. And here, public investment, it is important here to understand, is both, in a sense, is the beauty of that, is that it has both a demand component that helps to push demand in the short term, but is also part of the production function, the K that I mentioned before. So it would help potential growth then looking forward. Now, if you travel Germany, I think you can easily conclude that the infrastructure needs are pretty widespread.
I mean, considering that, you know, one of the richest countries in the world, the kind of infrastructure that they have, even basic infrastructure, is frankly not great. So I think there would be more need. If one believes, as I personally believe, that the issue of short-term of demand is not a short-term issue only, but we risk to be here in a permanent lack of demand and a saving glut. I think one should not worry too much the fact that it takes a bit longer to have the public investment in it. And then, you know, being pro-cyclical in an unintended way, I think they will still be, will be beneficial even if it takes a bit longer. At the same time, I agree also that one cannot hope that Germany, carries on its shoulders the whole continent. With two provisos, two caveats. The first one is that our studies, and more generally also those of the IMF, show that fiscal multipliers can be pretty large. Actually, when monetary policy is at the zero lower bound. So if you run the model, you see that the fiscal multiplier is considerably higher than in normal times, because you do not have the crowding out effect of monetary policy responding to that. So, the estimates here is that for 1%, and I quote by memory, 1 percentage points of additional investment done in the Netherlands and Germany at the same time would have an impact of 0.3 in peripheral countries. So not bad. Second point, second caveat, if Germany cannot do and should and probably should not go well beyond what is in its own domestic interest, I think the whole argument here would support the establishment of a fiscal capacity at the European level, which would then be enacted directly in order to sustain demand in the short and medium term.
I just want to do a very, very quick one on that. I'm going to get to you in a minute and Nick in closing. But one of the arguments that might fit in here, and I don't see it much in the European conversation, is the idea of independent fiscal councils. But having an independent fiscal council for Europe, whether, you know, with a composite body of different representatives, members of the public, experts, etc., is that something that you have ever thought of at the Commission level?
I'll give you a news. It's been established this week.
There you go.
Okay.
I'm always a week late to a good idea.
Now, okay. And actually, when I fly back, I am going to meet on Friday morning the new chair.
My only other question is, why am I not on it? But we'll get to that. We'll get to that.
You have a chance next time.
Excellent.
Okay. Jokes apart, it is okay. We are establishing a European Fiscal Board. It has just been appointed, and actually the chair is a Danish economist, Neil Tiggersen, who served. He's an old gentleman, very good in European matters. He sat in the Delors committee of which established monetary union at the time with Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa and others. So it is made of 5 members, including him as chair, being established right now. Actually, last week it was formally adopted, set up by the Commission. They start working now. Okay, they are in an advisory capacity, so they do not take decisions on what would be this on that, who spends, etc. So they are in a basic capacity, and they have a double task. One is to assess the implementation of the rules, so it's more the country by country perspective, and the other one is the assessment of the appropriateness of the aggregate fiscal stance for the euro area as a whole. So I think this is a potentially important innovation. Going back to the issue of trust, since one has to acknowledge, and I see it myself on my own skin, that the trust in the European institutions, including the Commission, has somewhat gone down during the crisis. having, let's say, a body of this sort, which would, in a sense, help add the voice to the what is the right fiscal stance globally taken, and how to apply the fiscal rules in difficult circumstances, may help to start to rebuild the
Yeah,
trust.
that's a good-
Even though one has to be a bit careful on this, because I mean, these are experts, and experts are not prime time TV characters nowadays.
Which is why you need me on the council. But anyway, we'll go there. Gentlemen here, and Nick, because of time, I want to get the two questions together and then respond and everything close. So, and if you can keep it to the point, that'd be great.
My question is about structural reform 2.0. You talked about rent-seeking behavior, and you talked about more inclusive taxation, and there's also the mention of the overbanking problem and, the 500-year lock-in with the villas. Do you think the EU Commission needs to take a more skeptical approach to concentrated power or money? Do you think that's sort of the source of some of these economic problems in the EU?
And then, Nick, on top of that.
Well, I also had a question about fiscal policy capacity and what that might actually need, and how the political coalitions for it could be built. So I like the idea of a fiscal council with a lot of economists, and I like the idea of putting Mark Blythe on it to help build these coalitions. And could this council come up with some kind of a proposal, not just for advice, but for a new regional structural fund, which would not be restricted to low per capita GNP regions, but it would be directed jointly toward countries with surpluses and with deficits, so that the engineering firms from northern Germany could design the projects that were actually built for infrastructure, but not in Germany. Let Germany handle its own infrastructure. The infrastructure would be built in southern European and Eastern European countries, but it would supplement the incomes, household incomes of those countries. So it would provide, among other things, a great deal of detailed work for ECFIN, the Directorate General, to articulate exactly how this money would need to be spent, not to achieve efficiency, but to build a coalition between the export industries in Germany and Finland, lots of elevators, from Kona, of course Siemens, maybe Alcatel, but the projects are quite complex because all of the work would be performed in the countries where the work would be done, even though it would be designed by engineering companies in the surplus countries. So that's my proposal for coalitions.
I'd like to take another question, but we're completely out of time. You're going to have 2 minutes
For
to
coalitions
go.
that would
So to
make
summarize,
this council
to summarize very, very quickly then, should you get involved in a frontal assault on the privileged and the wealthy, versus should you do regional policy through stealth, through the Commission, for multiplier effect in the periphery?
co-opt the wealthy.
What do you think?
Okay, now on the first one, big power, I have to say that we have a good tradition on that at the European Commission. I mean, the whole Department for Competition, the application of the state aid, antitrust, I think is very well established, and actually if you see also high-profile cases lately, Apple, for instance, and also other. This Apple is only the tip of the iceberg, and you have a lot also of multinationals within the EU which have been cracked down quite substantially. I think we have a good starting point for that. So very powerful competition policy, which by the way is something that it has not been called into question during the crisis, and I think it's on very firm ground. So I think one could definitely build on that in order to go beyond and maybe implement also some of these other policies, acknowledging, however, that not everything can be done centrally from Brussels, but the element of persuasion to have a more coordinated strategy built at the national level, I think is important. But we start we start with an, let's say, institutional infrastructure on competition policy, which is, I would maintain, stronger than in this country, for instance. Now, the second point is on, let's say, reviewing structural funds policies that we have now. Okay, let me have a macro perspective and one more micro perspective. The macro perspective is the following. We are pushing for completing banking union and for completing capital markets union. Capital markets union means, okay, the financing of innovative ideas, not so much by banks, but by venture capitalists, business angels, and crowdfunding, and so on and so forth, which is in Europe much less developed than in the US. So when I said that we are overbanked, that was also what it means. Now, if you complete and at least make progress on capital markets union, in macroeconomic terms, it means also something else. It means that there is the possibility of recycling the excess savings that you have in surplus countries like Germany and the Netherlands to the other countries, not via credit, which was the problem that we built up the bubbles before the crisis, going to real estate and fueling the bubbles in Ireland or Spain, but also via equity. Via equity. So this would be, let's say, in a sense, the channel in order to implement some of the things that you addressed. So, in a sense, moving towards capital markets union would create, I think, the financial environment more favorable for indicating, for going direction that you indicate. Now, the second point is that I personally think, is not within my shop, I have to say, so it is worth what it's worth, but my feeling is that the current structural funds, which are indeed addressed to the less favored regions, taking GDP per capita as the yardstick for that, will have to be rethought in a very fundamental way. I mean, in some countries, especially in Eastern Europe, the operation of the structural funds at in the year 2000, after these countries joined, actually helped fuel the bubbles in those countries. Now, we always talk now Euro area crisis, Greece, Ireland, Spain, but the crisis, when it crossed the Atlantic, first ended up in Eastern Europe, and you had in the Baltics, for instance, growing double-digit very, very strongly, and the transfers from the EU budget gone to the structural funds instead of going to productivity enhancing activities, actually help to fuel the bubble. So I think we'll have to rethink very substantially the operation of the structural funds, and this would be done in the so-called multi-annual financial perspectives, which will be the multi-annual EU budget post 2020. I think in that context, one could also explore some of the ideas that you have put forward. I think we need a fresh thinking on that, and not simply transferring resources, but also making sure that you create that cross-country partnership that allow to technology transfers within Europe, and not only from Europe or the US towards China and emerging economies.
Okay. Well, you came to Brown today for some fresh thinking on the problems you've been grappling with. I hope that we have given you something to think about, and I want to thank you for coming here today and speaking with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.